Hello. All right. Glad to see you guys again. It's been a while, huh? Let's see here. Make sure I get your names down. Yeah, I actually had to go to the hospital overnight. So I had the case pretty badly and have been kind of laid out of commission and haven't been doing any of my grading or anything, doing a lot of sleeping. But hopefully out in the clear now and ready to join the living again. And and get on with these weekly Zoom meetings. All right. Before I begin for this week, are there any questions? Anything that I need to be caught up to speed with? And of course, you could text as well as.
Professor, I had a question.
Sure.
I sent you a message on Canvas last week, I think, and it was right before your announcement. I was wondering if you had seen it or anything. I'm sure there's a lot more messages in there.
You know what? I can honestly say I haven't allowed this many to accumulate. I have like 16 messages that I plan to get to after this meeting. I'm so sorry, Caitlin.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I understand what you're going through.
Oh, but I honestly, I'm happy to be back and I'm happy to get caught up. So yeah, I could tell you that I'll definitely get on that very soon. Okay, I'm sorry, but yeah, chances are it's one of those 16 that I haven't even looked at yet.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, just out of the ordinary times, needless to say, very anomalous. And like I said, I couldn't be more excited to be back with a living and get back to business. And so I'll be happy to get to those messages. So by all means, please continue to message me with any questions or comments that you have. And just hopefully you're in stride with what we're doing throughout the semester. Just argumentative assignments virtually every week. Every about 3 subjects, we'll do a test, right? Every other subject, we'll do a quiz, and and that's it. I'll offer an extra credit assignment very soon. Your option of an argumentative write up, if you want to get to that. I've been given 5 points every time you attend one of these meetings. I'll probably end up giving you 7 today, just coming back and it being a little bit longer this week. Uh, and yeah, and so that's virtually my class. Zoom meetings back to normal, hopefully. That's what I'm planning for the weekly time, and that basically is all my class will entail. Remember, the tests are not accumulative. So once you pass these, 2 or 3 subjects, we get to move on and go to new material. And you don't have to worry about memorizing it or studying it again. And that's basically it. My class is pretty much just that simple. And so hopefully you guys are ready to take some notes here. Remember, I ask that you only do one again this week. I may in the future ask sometimes for you to do 2. But this week again, just 1 is fine. And but make sure that you read all of them and you've written some notes on all 4 sections, as they will all 4 pertain to test number 2. Okay, so this is the first subject we're doing, getting back into relevant to test 2. Okay, so with that in mind, what I want to do is I want to share the screen and show you some notes that I have here. Well, if I could find it, what the heck? Maybe I won't be able to. Let's see here. Stop live breakout rooms. Oh, I know that's what. Let me try this again. It's giving me, let's see here. looking for something that I have opened on Microsoft Word that in the past it has allowed me to share. Bear with me here. Shoot, whiteboard, screen. There we go. Okay. So we're doing the War for Independence, right? And we're looking at 4 sections for this week, and that which I want you to be familiar with. Okay, as far as any of you history majors moving on with U.S. history, and then also just to get you to critically think about a lot of the discourse, the type of dialogue, the type of discussion that they have regarding the war for independence. So, firstly, right, what I consider to be almost always considered context, right, like relevant, the relevant historical situation that usually is tied to discourse on this topic. So, from 1775 to 1783, we broke free from Great Britain, right, from England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, uh, to become independent as the United States of America. And here are some of the things that are considered pretty relevant to that conflict, if you will. Okay. So first of all, ambiguity of status. Remember, England does not have a definitive constitution like we have in this country. They don't have just a single document that's laid out black and white with, as far as legal justifications for why we're under the government that we are, what exactly is entailed with the rights and the duties of a citizen, as opposed to the rights and duties of the king and the rights and duties of parliament, etc. The English political tradition is a lot messier than that. It's considered English common law, and it's basically like a soup, an amalgamated soup of all types of variables. So they have written treatises, they have legal justifications written by jurists, they have legal decisions made by judges, they have royal edicts made by kings and queens, they have, of course, parliamentary laws made by parliament. It's really messy, and it's meant to be a mixture of all of that, right? That it's supposed to be like develop organically, like a growing plant or a tree, right? A living organism that just develops as it grows, as time goes on. And so all of those are supposed to kind of synthesize, kind of go together into formulating what is considered lawful and what isn't under England. So it's a messy situation to begin with, right? So, firstly, you have here, right, Sir Edward Coke in the famous Calvin case, and that's old school. That's very old school in contending that your allegiance to your crown, to your king or queen, right, is both personal to the person that is going to live and die and serve, etc., but also theoretical, that it's to whoever follows him or her, right, as the next king or queen, and that it is not meant to be volitional. It's not meant to be your choice. Whatever king or queen you are born under, it was God's will, right? Going back to the divine right of kings to the medieval time period, that it was pretty much God's will that you have to serve and obey that king or queen, and that king or queen is supposed to. I wouldn't go so far as say that it's a contract in the sense that if the king or queen doesn't do his or her job, it doesn't absolve you of your obedience. Your obedience is to be unconditional. From the moment you were born under the realm, under the kingdom of the king or queen, you owe allegiance for life to that position and to that individual, whoever's occupying that king or queen position, right? But theoretically, it wasn't just one-sided, and that according to the Koch decision, and centuries before this, other decisions as well in English history, is that there was supposed to be protection afforded by the king and queen, and they were supposed to afford you the rights of subjectship. And subjectship, right, is equivalent somewhat to what we would say today of citizenship, right? There's certain rights that are to be entailed and being a citizen. And in many ways, the rights of citizenship were kind of honed, were kind of worked out as far as what a citizen or a subject to the king or the queen is entitled to by way of people becoming naturalized in England. Because that's when they felt compelled to define what exactly is a right or an opportunity or a privilege that is to be, um, you know, to be cherished and practiced by a subject, right? So you could be a denizen, Denizen, and that was like a almost like a part-time partial subject, like if you were French or Spanish, right, or from another realm, and you came and lived in England, the crown would grant you certain rights and opportunities, but never the full rights of subjectship. So, for instance, if you were a denizen and you were granted partial subjectship by the king or queen, you couldn't just own property in the way that a natural subject could and have your son or daughter inherit it from you. You didn't have those same rights. You couldn't serve in parliament, etc. Right? So there were lots of variations and degrees of citizenship under England, which made it all the more messy. And then, of course, Parliament could grant you naturalization. And under naturalization, it didn't take long for them to conclude that if Parliament grants you naturalization, you are in fact entitled to all the rights of a subject of the king or the queen. But what about if you were born in Scotland under England, right? Or in Ireland, that part of Northern Ireland conquered by England, or in the Americas, right? Then they usually went by two precedents. They went by jus soli and jus sanguinis. Jus soli was your place of birth. If you were born in a place conquered and claimed by the English king or queen, and jus sanguinis, right, like sangre in Spanish, is by blood. If your father in particular was an English subject and you were born overseas somewhere else, especially controlled by England, then by default you were granted the rights of subjectship as well. So notice we as Americans were just one of several groups, like the Scots and the Irish, that were in kind of an ambiguous area, right, where it wasn't quite clear exactly what the rights of subjectship entailed, right? And then to get messier than that, right? John Locke wrote his second treatise on government, and he was not only a philosopher, but he was involved as a jurist, like a lawyer and an interpreter of the law as well. And in his second treatise on government, he made the relationship, or he tried to, because remember, English common law is to be organic, it's supposed to evolve in time and change, right? Um, he tried to make it more contractual, right? Whereby it was more conditional, in that the king or queen could not just resolutely claim absolute authority over us, our absolute undue obedience without promising something in return, right? And so in his second treatise on government, he talks about the natural rights, the idea of natural rights of life, liberty, and property, that the king or queen, but in particular, right, the laws of the land. And so he went beyond. John Locke went beyond the king or queen, and this makes it even further, even more kind of messy, is he really got involved with Parliament, because remember, Parliament was another evolution in history, and it evolved from kind of like the Privy Council of just giving guidance to the king or queen to progressively gaining more and more powers for itself as a political body, to so that by the time of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament claimed to be the spokesman, the primary spokesman, more than the king and queen, of England itself, right? And that the laws that were made by Parliament represented the will of the people. And that's when you get involved with sovereignty also, right? And the whole idea of sovereignty, Sovereignty. What is the source of authority? If you have someone down on the ground, right, you have power over that person until that person throws you off, metaphorically. But when the person gives up and says, "You are my rightful leader, I will obey you," then I would declare that this is not my definition, by the way, it's from what I've read, that then you've moved from the realm of power, mere power, to authority. and authority is more secure, right? Where, like I said, where people acknowledge your power and they obey it. So, what is the source of power? That's the argument of sovereignty, right? What is the fountain of it? What is the source of it? And according to John Locke and some of those who wrote in the Enlightenment, is they said sovereignty comes from the will of the people. That the king or queen at one stage in history, they surmised, was no better than just a thug who could wield his or her sword over other people and kind of lord power over them. But when the people gathered together and decided, you shall be our king, you shall be our queen, right? And especially under certain circumstances, like John Locke said, if you, as long as you protect our life, our liberty, and our property, then you shall be our king or queen, right? Then that moves as the foundation of sovereignty from the divine right of a king or queen, claiming, it's God's will made me king or queen, and I'm in charge, and I said so, and so that's enough as far as my authority goes, to we give you permission as a country, as a formal society, we give you our permission to be our king and our queen, and we shall obey you under these certain circumstances, provided that you, in a contractual fashion, protect our life, liberty, and property, and provide this or that for us in return. So notice, right, in the 16 and 1700s, England was already having its own drama over authority, over, what real power does the king or queen have over his or her people? And not to mention, right, now what about this power struggle between Parliament and the king? And from 1642 to 1649, England had a civil war. And Charles I, who did not want to share power with Parliament, literally lost his head. He lost the Civil War and was beheaded. And in 1688, they formed the Glorious Revolution, where they decided, right, that England would have um, certain certain statutes, certain expectations, certain requirements that had to be met by the king and queen for them to be able to be acknowledged to rule and to have their authority. And of course, it was largely not only circumscribed or limited by additions to the Constitution, but also it was circumscribed by a more powerful parliament that was increasingly saying, we are the true leaders of this country, not the king or queen. So England already had her own drama, her own civil wars, her own ambiguity and uncertainty about things, her own, polemics where people in the newspapers and in the courts were fighting over rights and obligations, etc. And we were the recipients of that. That was happening 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, by the 1760s, and when we got involved in this discussion and in this conflict. Okay, so all of this, I feel, no matter what your interpretation of the War for Independence is very relevant. That you ought to look to this as being relevant to why things went down the way that they did, right? And then also, if you've seen like Last of the Mohicans or something, right? The French and Indian War was titled here, the 7 Years' War, known in Europe. The French and the British were fighting along with their Native American allies and foes for control over North America, over Eastern North America. And England will win that war, right? And William Pitt and the Tory party back in England that had control of Parliament, they progressively came under the impression that we as Americans were not pulling our weight during the war. Each colonial assembly, for instance, we have 13 colonies, right? 9 of the 13 were royal, so that there was a royally handpicked governor. He could handpick his royal council and with the crown's permission. And then also there was a somewhat popularly elected assembly as the lower house that helped make the laws in each of these colonies, right? Well, by this time, the assemblies had declared that it was their right to decide how many of our boys were to fight for the English crown, how much in tax revenue they were to take out of the pockets of their people to help fund the French and Indian War. And then, as you might guess, William Pitt and the Tories felt as if we were not pulling our weight, that not a single colony was drafting enough boys to fight and was not taxing their own people enough to help pay for this expensive war. So by the end of the war, if my memory serves me correctly, England was like 13 billion shillings in debt. Even though they had won this war, they were broke. And so that was part of the reason, starting in the 1760s, in 1763, when we started that that action and reaction pattern of Parliament passing laws to tax us and to legislate things over our colonies, and our colonies basically saying no and protesting against Parliament's power to do such. Okay, because remember, under English common law, it was not clear who was sovereign, who the true source of authority was here in America under Great Britain. And so, of course, at this time, the Enlightenment became very, the Scottish and English, right? That should be actually the French and Scottish. Yeah, French and Scottish Enlightenment came about. And this was a series of writings, of books and pamphlets, mainly from France in the 1740s, that that really tried to bring about a paradigm shift, a different way of looking at the world, right? And as you might guess, like for the word enlightenment, is they contended that the world before the Enlightenment was like in a dark age of ignorance and superstition and tyranny, and that they were going to bring an age of reason, of science, of intelligence and rationalism, right? And a lot of them at their core were deists, Deists, and a deist, right, was like believed like God was like a great like watch or clockmaker and created everything by natural laws, scientifically verifiable natural laws, and that the best thing to do was to let everything in the universe function by its intended natural law, that whatever was natural was more healthy, right? And so, for instance, right, you have a guy named Rousseau, Roussseau, and he surmised as a political philosopher, he said he believed that everywhere man was meant to be born free, that the natural state of man, when he is naturally born from a woman, was the creator's intention was to be as free as possible. And I say as possible, we'll get to that later. But to be as free as possible, right? And that government was a necessary evil. That government, right? Like I think of like with the term of the social contract, I think of like if you guys have read oh gosh, what's the one where all those kids get marooned on an island? It was written in the 50s. Oh gosh, I read that back in high school. But they all get marooned on an island and everything becomes chaotic because they have no, it's anarchy. It's anarchy. They have no government. They have no institutions there on that island and everything goes awry. They literally start murdering one another. They form a cult. Um, Shame on me. I can't remember the name of that darn book. But at any rate, it's like that, right? The idea that in a natural state of things, in a state of nature, that everyone lived at complete liberty. And that's the way that God and nature intended things to be. But people being who they are naturally going to, they're going to take advantage of their liberty and they're going to infringe upon the liberties of other people, right? So it's one thing for you to do whatever you want to do. But once your actions begin infringing upon my freedoms and you start harming me by your actions, then you've overstepped your liberty, right? And so, hence, that people got together, they surmised with the first governments and said, well, you know what? We're going to give our permission, this whole social contract thing. We're going to give our permission for a government to rule over us, but they're not going to be our masters. If anything, they're going to be our servants. They're going to protect our life, our liberty, our property, right? That's their job, their sole job. And the moment they cease to do their job well, and our liberties are imperiled, then we have the right of revolution to remove them from power and elect a new group of people who will properly protect those rights. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, right, clearly Thomas Jefferson, who had written that, had read his Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his social contract book. because he pretty much explains that, right? That it's the right of the people to issue, uh, uh, give their consent to a government that protects their inalienable, their rights that cannot be alienated from them, their natural rights, right? Including, and he didn't say life, liberty, and property like Rousseau and Locke. He said life, liberty, and more broadly, the pursuit of happiness, right? Um, which arguably encompassed more. So, at any rate, the Enlightenment comes at this time. And what a convenient time for it to come, right? Because right when we're having conflict and friction with Mother England at the end of the French and Indian War, and England is trying to kind of stomp down on us and make it, wherever things were unclear, make it clear that England prevails. Now we have these Scottish and French and other writings that are telling us, no, these are your natural rights, and your government ought to exist only as your servant by your permission, to protect your natural rights, right? So the Enlightenment happens, and we have people like Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Dickinson, right? James Otis, who were kind of like the philosophical and literary, like midwives, right? Like the old school women that would give help a woman give birth to a baby. They were like metaphorically the midwives, as they carried those ideas that were percolating back in Europe, and they put them in their own words. Sometimes they just printed them verbatim, and they spread them throughout the colonies, right, to try to quote enlighten our citizens, as far as giving them in a sense of entitlement to what they believed were their natural rights as human beings, not just Americans, not just British subjects, but as human beings, right? And so the Enlightenment was big. And matter of fact, when you look at people who well, let me get back to that in just a moment. Then back in England itself, right, you had a guy named John Wilkes, and he was saying, you know what, Parliament is not truly representing the people. There are a lot of boroughs or districts that are not directly electing a single representative to Parliament. So hence, right, you look at a certain area in Modesto, let's say, and they don't have a congressional district. They don't have anyone directly elected in Modesto to represent us in Washington, D.C. It would be as if that, right, back in England. And so John Wilkes said, enough of these rotten boroughs. Every borough, every district needs to have an elected representative, a voice for their people. So when he was elected by his people, he was declared to be a rabble rouser, a troublemaker, an instigator, right? And so the Tories in Parliament, as well as the new young king, George III of England, who already had kind of an inferiority complex and kind of a conflict with Parliament itself because of his youth, his age, and because of his Germanic ancestry. He was German, and he was sitting on the English throne. So people resented that as well. So all kinds of components, right, to this messy, this mess that we call the War for Independence, back in England itself and over here across the Atlantic Ocean. So at any rate, John Wilkes, they didn't allow him to sit in Parliament. And then there was a guy named Benjamin Hoadley, and he was talking about how corrupt the Anglican, because remember, there was no separation of church and state in 9 of the 13 colonies. The royal colonies had an Anglican establishment with the Anglican Church of England, with their bishops and priests, etc. And they had an exact way of worshiping that they allowed and did not allow. And there was no tolerance of dissent, of disagreement, etc. Right? So Benjamin Hoadley was a big spokesman back in England against that, and saying how that was religious tyranny. And then you had two guys named Trenchard, Trenchardy, and Gordon, Gordon. And they had a very famous newspaper back in England called Cato's Letters. And what they were doing is they were just kind of amalgamating. They were putting everything together. Everything that was being espoused in the Enlightenment in Scotland and in France, everything that was being espoused by libertarians in England who were fearful of big government. They were put everything that they had read in history as far as tyrannical forms of government. They were putting together with the contemporary news of things that were happening in England, and trying to, almost, it almost borders on conspiracy theory. whereby they were trying to literally frighten the English citizenry and telling them, guys, this new King George III and his Tory party are trying to reverse your rights as Englishmen. They're trying to take them back from you and revert us back to a more tyrannical form of government here in England. So with those Cato's letters, right? Benjamin Franklin, he printed them here in the US, as did some of our other founding fathers, our intellectual founding fathers who were big on reading and the Enlightenment and all this, right? So they were percolating these ideas here in the States, in the colonies, right? So all this is going on at this time. And then, like I mentioned, and then also the just two more sources, if you don't mind, or a few more. The Scottish oppositions was libertarian, basically, right? Remember, libertarian government don't tread on me. You want government to stay as small and unobtrusive into your life as possible. And so the Scottish libertarians were getting a lot of press and getting a lot of trouble with the law and so forth at this time. And they were really big, like on our future, like Second Amendment, right? They don't want Big Brother to have a monopoly on weapons, but everyone should be able to be the arbiter of his own destiny, decide his own family's fate, protect his own home and village with his own guns and weapons, etc. So the Scottish liberals were really big at this time. It was all coalescing at the same time. And then you also hear in the States, in the colonies, you had the Great Awakening. And kind of like Benjamin Hoadley back in England against the Anglican authorities, is they were saying that the English Church of England, the Anglican Church, had become corrupt, worldly, tyrannical, and that they were trying to basically preach civil disobedience, right? Telling Americans, hey, I know that in many parts of the Bible, it says to obey the authorities, but there are exceptions, right? In the Old and New Testament, in which there are verses that can be found that state that when the governing authorities are no longer following God and have become, quote, evil, you have the right, even the obligation to rise up against them in the name of God and righteously rebel. So we have the Great Awakening going on, and that helped contribute to the atmosphere as well. And then, of course, a lot of the writers who were going back and forth when Parliament started passing taxes without our assembly's permission and so forth, they began writing under pseudonyms, these fake Roman names. And a lot of the Roman names, like Tacitus, uh, Cato, and these other names, right, represented people who did not want to see the Republic of Rome fall. Because remember, we have a republic, and that so did Rome, and it's meant to be a mixed government, a representative government of elected officials, right? And at least partly of elected officials. And but Rome's republic fell, right? It became an empire where the Senate became basically just a rubber stamp of the emperor, and the tribunes, the elected tribunes, became nothing, and Rome became more tyrannical in its latter days, right? And so they were conveying in the newspapers and in pamphlets and everything that England was going down the same road, and that we were our any liberties that we once thought we enjoyed were going down the drain, and that we had to fight for those liberties. So at any rate, are there any questions so far with all of that? I know that's a lot of information. It's a very factually rich topic, the war for independence. I'm sure someone better versed than I on this subject could make a semester out of this entire just out of this single topic. Okay, so so at any rate, when you look at these numbers on this argumentative assignment, you have some, right, who take a very kind of practical, almost kind of pro England stance, and the thesis that they have given the name to it has been salutary neglect. Okay, SALUTARY and then neglect. So let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and write that. Let's see here. So theses on this topic. So one is salutary neglect, and that was right that we virtually were neglected by England throughout much of the early 1700s, and that it had a salutary or healthy effect upon us. that on paper, our proverbial father, the king of England, right, had strict rules for us, but he never carried them out. He never enforced them. He was too busy with other affairs across the world. And so, hence, the child grows up and becomes very self sufficient, right? So, that's what you're going to find on one of the numbers. I believe it, I think it's the very first number, okay? Is you're going to find evidence of we as colonists, right? Virtually doing as we pleased. Our assemblies accumulated power after power, right? When England seemed to be busy with other affairs. And our people economically did whatever they wanted to do for a living. Because remember, under the mercantilist restrictions, it was on paper very strict who could do what economically for a living, but it just wasn't enforced, says our textbook, and say historians like Paul Johnson in his History of the American People book. And so that's what this thesis focuses upon. And arguably, this is the way the English see us to this day, is that we were kind of like spoiled brats as their proverbial children across the Atlantic Ocean. That from the very get-go, we virtually did what we wanted economically. We politically acquired and grabbed powers for ourselves in the form of the elected assemblies of the colonies, right? Without England taking much matter to it until the end of the French and Indian War. And then in 1763, when that war was done and England was in debt, and we had not carried our weight during that war to help fight the French, right? And they argued that we were arguably freer and had more opportunities under them and should have been more grateful for them fighting to be our leaders as opposed to the French. That then they tried to crack down on us, but then we were like the proverbial 18, 19-year-old son or daughter and said, sorry, Dad, too little, too late. We've been doing too well for too long. We don't need your help. And we're not going to listen to your authority now. So, for instance, right, um, at the end of the French and Indian War, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act stated, right, that in case it hasn't been clear up till now, Parliament speaks for the colonies. What Parliament passes as laws, they represent the colonies. And hence, if they want to tax you, if they want to make laws that you have to abide by, they are your spokesman. But remember, going back to John Wilkes, we didn't elect anybody into Parliament. So we were not technically, literally represented by anyone in Parliament. But that didn't matter. Parliament kind of arrogantly stated, well, you're virtually represented by us. And of course, that was not good enough for our founding fathers and for many of the Americans of that generation. They were not content with that explanation. So that's the salutary neglect thesis, okay? Is that we did well, we were defiant from the beginning, and we kind of fought to keep a good thing going, to keep those powers and those freedoms and those opportunities alive when England tried to crack down on us at the end of the French and Indian War. All right, so are there any questions on that? Okay, and then second, Bernard Bailyn, his court history of the American Revolution. Remember, for something to be revolutionary, it's supposed to bring about a complete 180-degree turn socially and how people like with their values and their culture, politically with the type of government that they abide by, and economically the type of economic system and who has access to what resources. All three of those categories are technically supposed to change radically for something to be revolutionary. And that's why, right, oftentimes in history, historians are very stubborn in using that term, right? They don't like using it very often because that's a hard criteria to meet, all three of those. So oftentimes, right, what do you hear about? The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, because it was so radically, it brought about such radical change in Russia in 1918. And the French Revolution in 1793, right, brought about some very radical changes in France at the fall of Louis the 16th. So people disagree on the American one, right? So, for instance, if you adhere to the salutary neglect thesis, you wouldn't call this a revolution, would you? You'd say, no, we had it well from the very beginning. We were defiant of English laws and restrictions. We did as we pleased, and we fought to keep that going. So, hence, there wasn't truly a revolution, right? Bernard Bailyn disagrees. But why I call it court history, right? Is remember, court history is like when a king or queen tells a court scribe to write a history of him or her and his or her kingdom. Is that person is going to write glowingly of him or her, right? That person is going to make him and his kingdom look wonderful. So same thing with American court history. Is it makes our country, it makes our founding fathers look wonderful. It's the history that we were taught as kids, right? And so Bernard Bailyn, he gives court history, and his book here, the ideological origins, right? The ideological, so beliefs, right? Not about power, not about economics, but about beliefs. The ideological foundations or origins of the American, what he calls a revolution, right? And so that's number two. And according to him, right, is we fought over those ideas that I've mentioned already today. The Scottish Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment about natural rights and the social contract, right? Um, and consent of the governed, and all those things, right? You have a Voltaire, Voltaire. Voltaire was big on what would later be called our First Amendment, freedom of expression, and to express yourself freely and so forth. That a government has to protect that natural right, right? As I mentioned already with Rousseau and Locke, you have the social contract, right, and the right to life, liberty, and property. Okay. Um, I would make the argument that Diderot and Condorcet uh, were the arguably the founders of the idea of the pursuit of happiness that that Thomas Jefferson included in the Declaration of Independence. The belief, right, that they wrote the first French encyclopedias, that the average common person ought to have the government protect his or her right to cultivate him or herself, to educate him or herself, and to go as highly in society as his or her ambitions and talents and abilities will allow him or her to go. Okay. Like I said, the Scots were all about the Second Amendment, right? There were several of them. The right to bear arms, etc., as included as a natural right, etc., right? And then also I would include Montesquieu. Montesquieu was big on about having a balanced representative government as a natural right that all nations and peoples are entitled to. And so when we had our written constitution that was federal and it was a republican form of government, etc., that arguably comes from Montesquieu's famous book called The Spirit of the Laws. So, according to Bernard Bailyn, okay, it was these ideas that really sparked our revolution, that it created a paradigm shift in the minds of Americans and got them to really believe in the a sense of entitlement to these rights, right? And began to genuinely put high demands on the British government to what they believed Americans as human beings are entitled to. Okay, so that's Bernard Bailyn's court history, claiming that we had a revolution and it was about ideas, right? And then we also have Joseph Ellis on number 3, and I would say his was mildly revisionist. Great man history of the founding fathers. So on this number 3, right, you're going to find evidence of a very selfish, very ambitious side to George Washington, a man who felt entitled to rise up the economic, I'm sorry, yeah, the economic as well as the military ladder, and felt like the British were snubbing him, that they were unfairly rejecting him and not allowing him to rise as highly as he believed his his abilities should take him. So you see a side of, like I said, a very somewhat egotistical George Washington on number 3, where he expects to rise. He sees himself very highly as far as his own abilities, and he finds it to be very irrational, unfair, unethical, that the British do not allow him to rise as highly as he believes he ought to. Okay. And I say mildly revisionist. Remember, revisionist, you want to revise the court history and make it different, right? Than the rose colored praising the founding fathers and all that. I say mildly because I could picture reading his book. I could picture George Washington defending himself and saying, well, it's not just about me. It's about all Americans, that I'm just one of many Americans who deserves better, who deserves to rise up the economic ladder, who deserves to rise up in the military establishment because of my skills. And the British are not allowing me to, because of their nepotism, because of their favoritism, that they're playing with people because of their family connections, their family names, etc. Right? It makes me think of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, his mother was a Randolph, a high-ranking noble family, and he was entitled to certain positions and opportunities because of his mother's bloodline, and he refused to take those positions because, as a quote child of the Enlightenment and reading everything that he was across the ocean, right? He was saying, no, that's from a bygone era of just getting what you want because of family connections, that it ought to be earned, it ought to be deserved. And according to Joseph Ellis, uh, George Washington felt the same way. But it's revisionist, right? Because, like I said, it shows a very selfish side to George Washington. And it makes you wonder, having read the book, okay, well, what if the British had accepted Washington with open arms? What if they had allowed him to move right up the military ladder of command? Would he not have joined the rebellion? Would he even have helped fight against the rebellion if he had been, received everything that he selfishly wanted from the British? So it makes you wonder. And then lastly, you have Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn's um, People's History of the United States. And then Howard Zinn, right? His is definitely Marxist. Okay, he comes from a perspective of proletariat. Those in the more modernizing economy, those who are the manual laborers, the poor workers with their hands, right? He sympathizes with the poor, and he, with the founding fathers, right? He depicts them as being very manipulative, very selfish, and very manipulative. That kind of like in line with Joseph Ellis's biography on George Washington, that the founding fathers had their own selfish ambitions and they were not being met by the British. So therefore, they had their own selfish reasons to rebel. And they looked at the poor and they saw their misery and they saw an opportunity to manipulate the poor, right? To use the British as a scapegoat for all the poor's problems and say, see, we're not the problem of your misery. We're not the source of your misery, even though we are a pretty well-to-do class between you and the British rulers, but the British are. And if you help us get rid of the British, right, we promise you all these things that are percolating, all these ideas that are percolating in the Enlightenment. So according to Howard Zinn, right, Bernard Bailyn, he sees the Enlightenment as a genuine source of, of inspiration for the American people, that we became familiar with these ideas. We developed a genuine sense of entitlement to those rights and opportunities in society, and that government ought to give those to us, and that's what led us in our war for independence. And that's what was revolutionary about our movement. According to Howard Zinn, right, those Enlightenment beliefs were mere propaganda, that the founding fathers did it because, I mean, what are you going to tell the poor? We have no intention to share power with you. We don't think highly of you, but we need you to fight and die with and for us. You can't be that honest, right? So you got to tell them, hey, fight with us. We're one of you. And we promise you these rights. We promise you this kind of open society when we kick the British out. Life will be better for you as well as for me. That it was kind of the carrot and the stick, and that was the carrot to get the people moving and to fight with and for the founding fathers as an elite class between the common Americans and the British rulers. All right. So I need you to be familiar with those theses, those arguments, right? At the bottom here, for test number 2. And like usual, I just need you to choose one of them to address in your written analysis and evaluation for this week, due Sunday night. Anybody have any questions? Questions or comments from anyone? Can I have anybody verify that you're with me? You guys, I could tell from your writings, you guys are very intelligent. You're catching the theses very well. But just here, okay, good. I got a thumbs up from Ryan. Thank you. Okay, so good, Caitlin. Thank you. So we're on the same page, right? Good, good. Yeah, I don't worry so much about at all, actually, about your intelligence. I worry about your interest. I just don't know if I'm boring you to death or not. It's a lot of information, huh? Thank you, Karen. It's a lot of information. Like I said, someone who's very well versed in this topic as a U.S. history professor could literally make an entire semester out of the War for Independence alone. It's just that loaded of a topic. Okay. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions, that's all from me. We've technically finished this week's assignment. And like I said, I will get to those Canvas messages, okay? Thank you so much for your patience. I'm so glad to be healthy again and ready to get back on the train. All right. So if that's it, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day, okay? Now I have your names. You'll get your 7 points this week, extra credit for hanging with me today. All right. All right. Thank you. You guys have a good week, okay?